Yeah, it looks like a standing room only audience, and we're delighted to welcome you all here to today. With my pleasure to sit next to Senator Cornyn, good friend and a wonderful colleague. In order to call this hearing to order, this is a subcommittee, Senate Finance, a subcommittee of the Senate Finance Committee, and our focus is international trade. It's customs, it's global competitiveness as well. And we thank our witnesses who've joined us. I think we have 3 witnesses who've joined us today. And I want to say a special thank you to our subcommittee's ranking member, not just Senator Cornyn, but also his staff and our staff and others who've worked with him on both sides of the aisle to plan this hearing, important hearing on digital trade. Today's hearing will offer an opportunity for us to answer not one, not two, but three central questions. And then the first is this. I think this is my favorite question: just what is digital trade anyway? I remember Senator Cornyn many years ago when I was I think the chair of a subcommittee on, I want to say, banking, and people were starting to talk about cryptocurrency and this and that, and I didn't understand it, and my staff didn't understand it, and neither did our colleagues understand it. This is at least a dozen years ago, and so we said, why didn't we hold a hearing? And so we held a hearing on it. And when we asked by the staff, why are you doing this? Why are you having this hearing? He said, well, we just don't understand it. At the end of the hearing, they said, well, do you understand it now? Well, not really. And there's some people who don't understand a whole lot about digital trade, why it's important, what it means. So the first question we're going to answer here today for folks who might be joining us near or far, the first question is, what is digital trade anyway? The second question is, why is it important to our country? Why is it important to Americans as well? And finally, how can we work with our allies? How can we work with other trading partners in order to strengthen our ever-changing digital economy? Today's hearing will also be the first Senate hearing in this Congress, I think, to specifically explore the importance of digital trade. And I'm glad that we can take this dedicated time in a bipartisan way. That's the way Senator Cornyn and I like to work, to dive into what I think is a critical issue, an ever important issue with leading experts across our nation. And when I first started learning about digital trade, I quickly discovered it's necessary for us to better understand and appreciate how digital technologies and the internet have transformed our economy. I want to just take a couple of moments to talk about this through an example. I love examples. I like to explain concepts and stuff with stories. And we're going to try to do that today, and we'll see how it works out. But in order to provide an example, we're going to use something that we've all come to know well, and that is smartphones. Smartphones. And let's see if I have one. I do. And my guess is for everybody in this room, I got to ask you to show us your smartphone. For everyone in the room, if you have a smartphone with you, just hold it up. John, do you have one with you? This is good. I think almost all of us. Yeah. This one lady back here doesn't have a smartphone. We'll have to get her one. But the smartphones are everywhere in our society. They're even in prisons with people who shouldn't have them. And that's a story for another day. And it's not every prison that happens, but it's certainly a concern when it does. But nearly everyone I know, probably everyone that you all know, has one. It's almost impossible to imagine our lives today without them. We use them for just about everything, from checking work emails to logging into a Zoom meeting to purchasing goods from halfway around the world, whether we happen to be booking a hotel in Dover, Delaware, or Dover, England. Smartphones have made our lives more accessible to just about everything. There are just a few examples in our day these are just a few examples in our daily lives that show how digital connectivity can make it easier, faster, less expensive to trade goods and services across our globe. And this is all made possible because the internet has made it easier for us to share information and data without geographic barriers. Without these tangible barriers, digital innovation has revolutionized nearly every industry across our country, our economy, ranging from manufacturing to agriculture to financial services to e-commerce, you name it, you name it. As a result, trading goods and services with a lot of help from the internet has exploded in recent years. Just look at the numbers. From 2005 to 2019, real value added for the U.S. digital economy grew at an average annual rate of more than 5% per year, outpacing the 2% growth in the overall economy during those same years. And the pandemic has spurred digital growth even more, with people staying home and turning to the internet to access medical services, to stream their favorite movies, or book that next vacation in the first state or in the Lone Star State or around the globe. And this growth isn't just benefiting consumers, it's also spurring job creation and enabling small businesses to thrive. With a digital economy, small business that sells jewelry in Delaware or Texas or some other place can now sell their products to just about anyone, anywhere in the world with ease. However, it's critical that as we examine the importance of digital trade for our economy or our economies, we must also acknowledge how digital technologies affect our national security. And right now, we're witnessing a global battle over the values that govern the digital economy. Foreign adversaries like China are using digital technologies to advance authoritarianism and crack down on freedom of speech and human rights. They are working overtime to shape the digital economy in a way that threatens our democratic values and jeopardizes our national security. Yet, as Albert Einstein once said, in fact, he used to say that not just once, but a lot. He used to say, "In adversity lies opportunity." I say that a lot, too. I always give him credit. But I think that's a great truth that guides me in my life, and I suspect for Senator Cornyn and a whole lot of other people in this room as well. That's exactly what we have before us today, a real opportunity to set the rules of the road for digital trade that reflect our values. And those words were true then. In adversity lies opportunity, and they are even truer today. So far, the U.S. has taken a leadership role through negotiating ambitious digital rules and the USMCA agreement we have with Canada and Mexico, what used to be called NAFTA, and through digital trade to cooperation with Japan. But that's not enough. Our work can't stop there. And that's why this past July, my staff and I work closely with one of our colleagues from the other side of the aisle, Senator Young, and his staff and other members of this committee to introduce a bipartisan, bicameral resolution advocating for the United States to work with our allies across the globe to establish forward-looking digital trade policies. I'm also eager to work with the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and the Biden administration to make progress on these important issues as they negotiate something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and other economic engagements relating to digital trade. So in that spirit today, I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel of witnesses to pull back the curtain on the importance of digital trade and how we can work with our allies in this country, but especially outside of this country, to advance thoughtful digital trade policies. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to my wingman on this committee and others, Senator Cornyn. John, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing, and it's been a pleasure, as always, working with your staff. And thanks to all of our witnesses for being here and sharing their expertise and knowledge. I like the three questions that you plan to ask and have teed up here. This subcommittee is consistently focused on the threat that China poses to our national security through its weaponization of trade, contrary to the international rules-based system that we thought they were joining when they became part of the WTO. On that note, I want to express my concerns with regard to reports that our allies in Europe may retaliate for provisions of the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act in the face of existential challenges posed by the Chinese Communist Party and its allies in the Russian Federation. A strong relationship with our partners in Europe is more important than ever. Unfortunately, legislation passed on a purely party line vote like the Inflation Reduction Act has moved us in the wrong direction. And I hope the administration will work to limit the trade ramifications from this bill with regard to Europe and our other allies. We all know that the results of protectionism have helped in the past our nations put us into the Great Depression nearly a century ago, and we simply cannot afford to repeat it or get anywhere near it. On this subcommittee, we've advocated for the U.S. to join the CPTPP, which was a mistake for us to walk away in the first place. I was with Senator Haggerty, the former ambassador to Japan, now a member of the U.S. Senate, and Senator Cardin, our colleague on the Finance Committee in Japan recently. Every single meeting we had with our Japanese government counterparts, they mentioned the TPP. And Senator Carper and I have written and spoken together on what a mistake it was for us to walk away from that. And my hope would be at some point we would get back in the game in Asia with the CTP.
Would my colleague just yield for just a moment? Self-inflicted wound.
Yeah,
That's
I agree.
exactly what I discovered. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Unfortunately, so far, the Biden administration has refused to reopen negotiations on that agreement. So we need to look to sectoral specific free trade agreements focused, for example, on digital trade. This was also part of the conversation we had with Ambassador Emanuel in Japan when we were there. As each of our colleagues know, free trade agreements passed through Congress are insulated from domestic political pressure. They provide long-term certainty for our businesses and reinforce the key economic relationships that we have with our friends and allies. We've also focused on China's use of censorship as a barrier to digital trade in particular. We see today how China is weaponizing its digital infrastructure against its own citizens by simply protesting in the streets. One of the first tasks we should explore is how to define digital trade, which is what Chairman Carper, the question he raised first, and appropriately so. For everything digital or virtual, from the cloud to artificial intelligence, there is obviously an underlying physical element. For digital trade, that medium is semiconductors. So maybe we should start by using that physical apparatus as a starting point for our discussions. The second area we should explore is how digital trade agreements help to solidify our relationship with our friends and allies against the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. So I believe any digital trade agreement with our allies and partners should include provisions that incorporate disciplines on semiconductors as part of it. That includes things like coordination of semiconductor incentives, harmonization of our export controls with regard to China, and supply chain resiliency. Finally, and most importantly, we should find common areas of agreement amongst all stakeholders to include business, labor, and national security. That includes topics like preventing data localization and forced technology transfers. We should have free and open digital trade facilitation with clear rules of the road. For example, we should not be taxing electronic transmissions between our borders or forcing data centers to be located in one nation or another. As with all issues pertaining to China, that'll require a fair amount of discussion, debate, and even compromises. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today that represent a facet of each of those. I'd like to welcome Mr. Feith for the national security perspective, Mr. Woodall for the labor community, Ms. Bliss from industry, and Mr. Metzger from the think tank community. That's important. Give us the intellectual firepower we need to make good decisions here in Congress. So thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to introduce as our first witness Christine Bliss, who is the president of the Coalition of Service Industries. I always like introducing a president. My wife will say to me when I get home tonight, she'll say, who did you meet with today? I say, well, the president. And she said, in what capacity? I say, well, she was a witness before my committee. And she'll say, you mean the vice president? No, the president. So, but anyway, Madam President, we're delighted that you're here. Brought these colleagues with you. The Coalition for Service Industries, you're the president of the Coalition of Service Industries, I'm told. And the Coalition for Service Industries represents the interests of the American service economy, which employs, I believe it's 75% 6% of the American workforce and generates some three-quarters of national economic output. That probably would surprise a lot of people. Previously, Ms. Bliss served as the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Services, for Investment, for Telecommunications, and E-Commerce. She also served in numerous roles in the World Trade Organization, including the lead negotiator in the Doha Services negotiation. Ms. Bliss, you have the floor. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and also appreciate the participation and comments from Ranking Member Cornyn. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and be part of this distinguished panel of witnesses. I am Christine Bliss, the president of the Coalition of Services Industries, a nonprofit association representing U.S. firms on services and digital trade issues. Our members include distribution, logistics, financial services, professional services, and ICT services companies, including manufacturers of consumer technology, telecommunications equipment, and health and nutrition products. Our members operate in all 50 states and over 200 countries and represent both large, medium, and small firms. The digital economy is not just about benefits to the information technology sector. And I think too often that narrow view and maybe misunderstanding is out there, so hopefully we can correct that. It is essential to companies both large and small and economy-wide, including manufacturing, I think as you mentioned in your opening remarks, agriculture, health, education, environment, transportation, logistics, communication, finance, distribution, media, and entertainment. And it's a major source of existing and future jobs. To ensure that all Americans, including more workers, small businesses, and communities, enjoy the benefits of digital trade, the U.S. must address growing digital protectionism abroad through high-ambition trade initiatives, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, that include binding and enforceable digital disciplines and remove discriminatory barriers and promote economic inclusivity. Working together, Congress, the administration, industry, labor, farmers, environmental groups, and other stakeholders can shape a digital policy that is both ambitious and inclusive. The digital economy, as you so aptly pointed out in your opening remarks, touches all aspects of our lives, from texting friends, working or shopping online, using digital technologies, service, and software on the factory floor, from design, production, to after-sales and service of autos, tractors, planes, consumer goods, and other products, to doctors conducting heart surgery with the aid of digital services and technologies. In 2021, the digital economy generated $3.7 trillion in gross output, over 10% of total U.S. GDP, and supported 8 million U.S. jobs. Many U.S. jobs, both blue and white collar, are now requiring digital skills, and it is critical that workers get the digital training they need to take advantage of those job opportunities. Digital trade was and is a key source of resilience during the pandemic. From 2019 to 2021, digitally traded services exports increased by $74 billion, while in a number of services sectors, exports actually declined.
Well, repeat those numbers again.
So from 2019 to 2021, digitally traded services exports increased by $74 billion. And it's notable because I think, as we know, services exports in a number of sectors actually declined during that period. And Mr. Chairman, in Delaware, in 2021, services exports exceeded their 2019 levels on the strength of digitally tradable exports, including financial and insurance services. 1/3 of small businesses state that they would not have survived the pandemic without access to digital tools. Cloud services allowed manufacturers to continue their operations. The healthcare industry was able to expand its reach through telemedicine. Now Optics, a small business in Indiana, now provides virtual eye exams to patients across the U.S. The digital economy also enables proliferation of small business. Estate Auctions, Inc., a Delaware-based small business with 14 employees, exported products to 62 countries using a digital e-based platform. Olaris, a woman-owned life sciences lab in Boston, used AI to develop a non-invasive kidney transplant test. Marketing for Greatness, a Texas-based female sole proprietor digital marketer, led the international expansion of a Fortune 500 company. And Cloud to Street in New York, a woman-based, woman-owned small business, uses digital tools to analyze flood risks in climate-vulnerable communities internationally. Digital services allow small businesses in every single state to engage in global trade at a large scale. Good digital trade policy promotes American values like democracy and freedom, as was reflected in your remarks and Senator Cornyn's opening remarks. China and other authoritarian regimes are imposing their own digital rules of the road, which are at odds with these values and present national security concerns. Like-minded trade partners should be standing shoulder to shoulder to defend democratic values through a rules-based trade system that adheres to long-standing norms of non-discrimination and openness. And we commend you, Mr. Carper and Senator Young, for your leadership in the resolution you introduced, encouraging cooperation, coordination with allies, and also listing digital trade barriers. And we think that was incredibly useful. We must address discriminatory services and digital trade barriers through strong digital disciplines that include AI principles, good regulatory practices for digitally enabled services standards, SME digital capacity building, and worker digital upskilling. My written testimony lists CSI-specific recommendations, and APEF seems to provide the most immediate opportunity to create these binding and enforceable rules. And it may also be a building block toward rejoining CPTPP, and we share the concerns and views that both you and Senator Carper expressed in that regard. Congress has an important role to play in shaping these disciplines, and CSI supports a bipartisan extension of Trade Promotion Authority. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Madam
Thank you,
President.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. And we'll now turn to our next witness. Sitting on your left is David Fife. David is the Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Is that correct? Do I have that right? Good. Center for a New American Security is a bipartisan think tank that focuses on developing strong and smart national security and defense policies. Prior to his time at the Center for New American Security, Mr. Fife served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and for Pacific Affairs. I'm sure there's a lot more that I could say about you, but we're going to hold it there so you'll have the opportunity to talk. And with that having been said, you have the floor. Welcome. We're delighted to see you. Looking forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your invitation and that of the ranking member, and appreciate the whole subcommittee for this opportunity. My written statement addresses digital trade and China, and in particular, the national security problem of China's open access to American data. It explains that America should not only work overseas to expand digital trade with our friends, but also move urgently at home to curb massive unregulated flows of sensitive data to China. Now, I'd like to stress immediate action possible in 3 areas. First, to ban TikTok. Second, to begin controlling exports of Americans' biodata. And third, to implement a process endorsed by both the previous and current administrations, but not yet in use, to limit U.S. data flows to China. Now, in our unfortunately polarized politics, it's a sign of health that there's strong bipartisan support for countering China's threats. A major one is China's approach to digital trade, which is a key element of China's national security strategy. Chinese leader Xi Jinping says that data in the 21st century is like oil in the 20th century, the critical input for economic strength and national power. About a decade ago, Xi declared the vast ocean of data, just like oil resources during industrialization, contains immense productive power and opportunities. Whoever controls big data technologies will have the upper hand. Under Xi, the Chinese Communist Party has made a strategic priority of exploiting data both inside China and around the world. This includes personal health records, genetic sequences, and online browsing habits. It includes corporate trade secrets, supply chain records, and financial accounts. And then includes the photos, voice recordings, and mapping imagery pulsing through the world's smartphones, as the chairman noted, and drones and smart cars. Data control is also critical for China's global influence and censorship operations. Hence, Beijing's aggressive regulation of Chinese apps such as TikTok. Through that app, Beijing harvests mass American data and transmits favored messages, gives censorship guidance, and can influence young Americans in ways that are without precedent for a foreign power in history. All this is the stuff of digital trade, yet there are effectively no rules governing any of it, not international trade rules and not domestic regulations. My written testimony cites some additional issues, such as the importance of Japan's admirable initiative in this field known as data free flow with trust. But in the time available for immediate focus, I'll note that U.S. policy can prioritize at least three areas. First, TikTok and the TikToks to come. The Biden administration is reviewing national security dangers posed by TikTok. Republicans Marco Rubio and Mike Gallagher have urged legislation to enable a ban. Democratic Senator Mark Warner, a member of this committee, recently endorsed a TikTok ban in principle, calling the platform an enormous threat. The TikTok issue is a test of our seriousness about data privacy, counterintelligence, election integrity, and democratic sovereignty. No hostile foreign power is entitled to control a leading U.S. media platform. And keeping hostile foreign powers from wielding such influence is a safeguard of our free speech. But TikTok is also a test for the data threats still looming on the horizon, like China's ambition to export metaverse companies to the U.S. market, as it has for social media. A second immediate matter, biodata. Clearly, Americans should protect their health and genomic and medical data to safeguard both privacy and national security. Yet our laws and policies don't do this. President Biden has announced measures to promote domestic biotech, but we still have effectively no protections regarding exports of biodata. While we struggle with this, Chinese companies such as Wuxi AppTech and BGI are expanding operations in the United States. These companies answer to Beijing's party state and military. China's access to U.S. health data, especially DNA, threatens harms with multi-generational consequences. Third and finally, the importance of the new regulatory mechanism known as ICTS. This may be the best tool Washington has for all these issues. It could address a range of problems, including, for starters, data centers. The Commerce Department has not yet taken enforcement action against Chinese firms that may be improperly accessing so-called large data repositories, despite a 2021 executive order threatening action. In drones, too, the Pentagon has tied Chinese drone giant DJI to China's military. Yet DJI still dominates the U.S. commercial market. There are other Chinese players in the U.S. commercial market, such as Autel. Drones have not been the subject of any known ICTS enforcement action or even investigation. Then there are autonomous vehicles and digital mapping. Many leading U.S. companies in these fields rely on Chinese financing and engineering, yet they can freely export sensitive data about U.S. roads, maps, and critical infrastructure. ICTS, led by the Commerce Department, has a mandate to address all these issues: data centers, drones, autonomous vehicles, and more. But it hasn't yet taken action. This issue would seem to warrant attention from the White House and the Congress. As we've said, digital trade and China's threats to U.S. security are overlapping fields of bipartisan concern. So it's a privilege to appear today. The stakes are very high, and I thank you for holding the hearing.
No, we thank you. Thanks for joining us. Very nice to meet you, and welcome. Our third witness, we have four, three with us in person. Our third witness in person is Dr. Joshua Meltzer, and he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where his research focuses on international economic relations and the intersection of technology and trade policy. Is that right? Good. Dr. Meltzer also leads the, I think this is a quote, tell me if I've got this right, the Digital Economy and Trade Project. Is that the project you lead? Okay. And he co-leads something called the Forum for Cooperation on Artificial Intelligence. Prior to Brookings, he spent 8 years at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and trade as a trade negotiator and a diplomat at the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Are you a native of Australia? Oh, good. Well, Dr. Meltzer, we're delighted that you're here. The floor is all yours. Thank you. Welcome.
Chair Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I work on digital trade issues, as well as on emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. Today, my testimony will address the opportunities of e-commerce and digital services trade for the US with a focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. I'll also discuss evolving global AI regulation and how trade policy can support digital trade consistent with US values and strategic objectives. As you noted, Senator, there is no globally agreed definition of digital trade. However, it is a term increasingly used to describe an ecosystem that is more expansive than e-commerce and includes cross-border data flows and how data and digital technologies such as cloud computing and AI enable trade. Trade agreements now have digital trade chapters instead of e-commerce chapters that include new commitments such as not to prohibit cross-border data flows and require data localization as a condition for doing business subject to GATT's Article 14 style exceptions. Digital trade chapters aim to encourage regulation that builds trust in cross-border data flows. Digital trade commitments can deliver significant economic gains for the US. The 2019 US ITC assessment of the economic impacts of USMCA found that the digital trade chapter is a key driver of the economic gains for the US. These rules were found to have significant positive impacts on industries that rely on cross-border data flows, including for firms in the services economy, manufacturing and agricultural industries. One aspect of digital trade is e-commerce, which represents a real opportunity for small businesses to export and reach customers globally. A key development has been platforms such as eBay, Amazon, Etsy, Mercado Libre in South America, and Lazada in Asia, to mention a few. These platforms solve many of the barriers that have previously prevented small businesses from exporting by providing integrated payment solutions, trust mechanisms, cheap and effective dispute settlement, and links to express delivery services. The opportunity for small businesses to engage in digital trade has been enabled by trade policy. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement reduces the costs of getting goods through customs. USMCA raised the de minimis customs duty levels in Canada and Mexico, which has led to increased e-commerce sales. Commitments on electronic signatures and electronic authentication provide important legal frameworks that allow for digital cross-border transactions, and commitments to not restrict data flows and to encourage interoperability among digital payment systems also enable e-commerce. Services exported online is another growth opportunity for the US. The US has been exporting more services than it imports for over 30 years, and services now comprise around 40% of total US trade, but services are an even more significant share than that. This is because around 30% of US goods exports comprise services value added used in the production of goods. The net result being that over 60% of total US exports comprise services, and a lot of these services can be exported online. Recent OECD data shows that the US is the world's largest exporter of digitally deliverable commercial services, over 3 times larger than its nearest competitor, Germany, and 2.2 times larger than the UK. While digital trade is an opportunity for US businesses, the OECD Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index shows high levels of digital trade restrictions globally. This includes in countries such as India and Indonesia that are participating in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations. And the digital trade restrictions in these countries pale in comparison to China, which is one of the world's most restrictive digital trade regimes. Digital trade also affects access to and the development of key digital technologies such as AI. Recently, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan identified 3 families of technologies, including computer-related technology that includes AI, which are described as force multipliers throughout the tech ecosystem where US leadership is needed from a national security imperative. While the US is a world leader in AI, many countries are moving to regulate AI and expand AI R&D cooperation. China, second only to the US in terms of AI capacity, has begun to roll out its own AI governance framework, which includes regulations on the development and deployment of AI algorithms, as well as increased control over Chinese technology firms leading in AI development. China is also exporting its model for AI regulation to other countries in the Indo-Pacific and globally. Some countries are now using trade agreements to support AI specifically, but the US has yet to do so. The US certainly is the largest and most innovative digital economy that creates opportunities for digital trade for both small and large businesses. The US has led development of digital trade rules in USMCA and CPTPP, but renewed US leadership is needed to develop rules that govern digital trade more broadly. Yet while the US decides what to do, the world is not standing still. China is leading the development of rules on digital trade in RCEP and is seeking to join the CPTPP, where it will be able to influence the next generation of digital trade commitments. The forthcoming IPEF negotiation is the next opportunity for the US to re-engage in the development of digital trade rules that support economic opportunities for US firms and workers and to shape the global context. Thank you.
We are in the process of voting, so Senator Carper stepped out, so I will introduce our final witness, Mr. Patrick Woodall, the Policy Research Director at the AFL-CIO Technology Institute. He also serves as a board member for the Trade Justice Education Fund, which is a nonprofit that sponsors public education programs designed to expand awareness about the worker rights, environmental and climate, and public health implications of U.S. trade policy. He's been a policy expert and researcher for 3 decades, advocating for economic and social justice. Mr. Woodall, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Cornyn and Chairman Carper and members of the committee. It's a great opportunity to testify today. I'm here on behalf of the AFL-CIO Technology Institute, the AFL-CIO, and the more than 12 million union members working in every state and every sector of the economy. The labor movement is deeply interested in international trade policy. Trade deals have cost millions of manufacturing and service sector jobs, upending the economic security of working families and worsening America's economic and racial inequality. But we're focused on digital trade as well. The digital trade discussion frequently sounds like it has no grounding in the physical world, which Ranking Member Cornyn referred to. It's internet-enabled commerce and big data and cloud computing, and it's all of those things, but it affects real workers in the physical world. Because cross-border digital commerce has offshored tens of thousands of US call center and back office jobs, and this low-road offshoring has fueled a digital underclass of gig workers in the developing world that power artificial intelligence systems. These ghost workers tag images and code information for low pay, including in India and the Philippines, which have notoriously poor working conditions and weak labor law. And digital trade powers the automated decision-making and algorithmic management software that increasingly hires, controls, evaluates, monitors, and even fires workers in the United States. These technologies can shortchange workers' earnings, expose workers to unsafe conditions on the job, infringe on the right to form unions, and exacerbate employment discrimination. All these workers are directly impacted by global digital commerce on the job, but they're also impacted at home. Big tech companies collect, combine, and commodify vast troves of personal data that compromises everyone's privacy. The algorithms that power social media have pushed online hate, political disinformation, and harmed the mental health of young people. But the existing trade model makes it harder to safeguard workers, consumers, and society from the known and emerging downsides of the digital economy. First, the current digital trade deals grant broad, unfettered powers to companies to ship data and deploy software worldwide. These authorities over data and software are more expansive than for trade rules on physical goods. Second, the digital trade rules rigidly limit or forbid government oversight of the technology sector, as well as its data and its software products. The technology industry appears to view that any oversight, including efforts to safeguard digital privacy, are illegitimate trade barriers. The digital trade provisions almost read like high-tech commandments, Thou shalt not limit cross-border data flows. Thou shalt not require any data to be maintained domestically. Thou shalt not look at the source codes that power software that affect workers and consumers. Since the 1990s, trade agreements have constrained domestic governance to curb so-called non-tariff trade barriers. Long-standing regulatory approaches have been subjected to trade tests to determine if they're permissible rules or illegal trade barriers. At the WTO, fewer than 5% of challenged regulations have been upheld in trade disputes. The stringent regulatory restrictions in digital trade are fundamentally different because we're just starting to grapple with meaningful oversight of these technologies. It'll be easier to challenge efforts to rein in the downsides of these technologies as illegal trade barriers because of our limited legal and regulatory foundation. Bipartisan efforts to protect personal data, address anti-competitive platform practices could run afoul of existing digital trade language. So the combination of unilateral corporate powers and narrow regulatory constraints in digital trade can lock in a largely unregulated technology landscape. It's time for sort of a strategic reset to create a worker-centered digital trade policy. This is not a binary choice between China's Great Firewall and a totally unregulated technology sector. We must be able to protect personal information in critical sectors by establishing restrictions on vulnerable cross-border data flows. Digital trade deals should encourage rather than deter government efforts to protect personal data inside and outside the workplace. Safeguarding critical infrastructure and personal data not only protects the security of the economy and people, but also helps keep good jobs here in the US. We must be able to meaningfully oversee source codes and algorithms to robustly enforce current labor and employment laws and enact new laws to address emerging issues like electronic workplace surveillance and digital privacy. The Congress and the public should decide the rules of the road for technology. It can't be left up to big tech companies and international trade tribunals. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Senator Carper, the chairman, is not back, so I'll proceed with some questions, and I'm sure I'll turn it over to him when he returns. So, Dr. Meltzer, I'm looking at your testimony here. I wasn't here for the beginning of the answers to Senator Carper's questions, but I'll just read this. You say there's no globally agreed definition of digital trade. However, it is a term increasingly used to describe an ecosystem that is more expansive than e-commerce, which is focused on trade in goods and services purchased online. Digital trade includes the important role of cross-border data flows and how data and digital technologies such as cloud computing and artificial intelligence can enable trade. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, Senator.
And let me just ask our other witnesses, Ms. Bliss, do you agree with that definition, or do you have any differences?
No, I don't have differences. And I think that Dr. Meltzer has adequately described it. And in my written testimony, we try to elaborate that, in our view, the digital economy certainly is what are referred to the pipes, the infrastructure, the fiber optic cables, the technology that enable the internet, and then the platforms, technologies, software and services that build onto that to enable the functioning of the digital economy itself. And then, of course, all the various apps that are being developed and the emerging technologies in this space. And then, I guess at a core, you could say that it's about electronic transmission of data across the internet and the content that's included there. But I would be in agreement.
Mr. Feith, I know you focused on national security aspects of this issue. Obviously, the internet has proved to be a boon to businesses and individuals to share information. And of course, we're a free society where people are free to communicate. But our adversaries, particularly the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, use information warfare essentially to steal our data, but then to do everything from engage in disinformation or active measures campaign like they did in 2016 during the presidential election. Talk to me about the benefits of us entering into some digital trade agreement with our democratic allies and how that plays into this, sort of split personality when it comes to digital information in a free societies versus autocratic societies.
Thanks, Senator. I think the split personality point is well put, and I think that some of your definitional question and the answers we've heard also highlight a really valuable and important quality of this whole discussion, which is that some of what makes this difficult and dangerous as an issue when it comes to the role of hostile adversary countries in digital trade and in our domestic digital economy is that the nature of so much of digital trade is unlike the nature of traditional trade that passed, in physical goods by truck and ship and horseback over the years, where fundamentally there was a structure among nations where the trade was controlled at borders and arranged between countries according to agreements. The internet was born and then established with none of that. There was no need to go open any other countries. We all, allowed the internet to emerge all over the world. And as we've said, there were enormous benefits to this in matters of, prosperity and quality of life and all the rest. And yet it causes also the national security challenges that we face today, where in a way completely without analogy to the physical trade in goods, we have adversary country state actors and state-backed actors operating in our telecommunications networks, in our, across our digital economy, meaning in our pipes, in the platforms of the delivery of these digital goods and services, and in our politics through the use of platforms like TikTok and other social media platforms where not only can data be harvested, but the export of the censorship and propaganda objectives of the Chinese Communist Party, for example, can be done at scale in a fashion that was simply impossible in the pre-digital age. And we don't have mechanisms in our international trade rules, and we really don't have mechanisms even in our domestic regulation for dealing with this. We have the Committee on Foreign Investment for handling inbound foreign investment. We have export controls for licensing and restricting the traditional export overseas of goods and services and some technologies. We have federal procurement restrictions that restrict what federal departments and agencies and their contractors can purchase. But our federal regulatory structures have traditionally been just silent on an enormous range of domestic digital commerce that has international digital trade implications. And that has to do with what people put on their phones, what companies do when it comes to their drones or their surveillance cameras. It has to do with the handling and sharing overseas of our most absolutely sensitive data, such as our genomic, DNA information. These things have been effectively untouched by the traditional tools that we know for national security, restrictions and approaches to matters of commerce. And that's partly why we have such a challenge here. It's also partly why this new ICTS regime represents such a potentially valuable and important new element of the national security regulatory mix, because we now have had on paper the creation of this institution. It's like CFIUS, but it's for cross-border data flows, And instead of being led by the Treasury Department, it's led by the Commerce Department. It was put out initially in the waning period of the last administration, endorsed in the first months of the current administration, but it exists only on paper. It's never actually taken action, not against data centers, not against drones, not against autonomous vehicles and digital mapping, and not against anything relating to the biodata particular priority. And it would appear that the case for that is really just very strong and rather overdue.
Thank you.
All right, colleague, I think since I was off voting, we've been joined by our chairman of the full committee, Senator Wyden. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Catherine Cortez Masto. Catherine, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining. And also by a new member of our team, a new member in the Senate, Senator Grassley, who's been here actually as long as, how many years have you served in the Senate now?
42.
42, but who's counting? That's great.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot.
It's just a number.
It's just a number. That's great. Well, congratulations to both of you on your re-elections, and delighted that you were able to join us today. My first question is pretty easy, and several of witnesses have used the term ICTS regime. People watching us on television probably have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not very good at acronyms. How would you explain, over you, Mr. Fife, how would you explain that to your grandmother?
The unpronounceable acronym happens to stand for Information and Communications Technology and Services, which isn't how I'd begin the explanation for my grandmother, though.
Oh, good. How?
This
Is your grandmother still alive? Is she still alive? She might be watching.
No, unfortunately not, but we have a daughter who's named for her. So
oh, well, good.
That's an alternative.
Next best thing.
This is meant to be a structure inside the U.S. government that pulls together expertise from all the relevant parts of the executive branch, national security departments and agencies, commercial and economic departments and agencies, and the intelligence community, in order to assess the national security implications and risks of all of the enormous flows of data that go cross-border, especially between the United States and so-called foreign adversary countries, beginning with China and Russia.
All right, I think your grandmother would probably say, that's my grandson. I'm so proud of him. So, all right, thanks for doing that. Got a question really for all of our witnesses. And I think we'll lead off, Ms. Bliss, with asking you to respond to it initially. But as the leaders of this subcommittee, Senator Cornyn and I have long advocated for re-engagement with our allies in the Asian Pacific region. He's mentioned this, John has mentioned this, but after the previous administration abandoned multilateral trade cooperation, now as the Biden administration works to reclaim a seat at the table with our Indo-Pacific economic framework, digital trade presents a clear opportunity for U.S. leadership in this critical region. We know that both our allies and our adversaries in the region are racing to write the rules of the road on digital trade. And our allies have been clear that they welcome our partnership on the digital trade in order to advance our shared values. Here's my question for each of you. What specific digital trade policies should the United States advocate for in the Indo-Pacific economic framework? I'll just say that again. What specific digital trade policies should the United States advocate for in the Indo-Pacific economic framework in order to advance our economic security and geopolitical interests? Ms. Bliss, would you be our leadoff hitter there, and then Mr. Fife, and then we'll go down the line.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we did supply to the committee as an annex our specific recommendations with regard to IPEF and more generally in terms of what we believe should be included in the digital chapter. But let me highlight some areas, and that is we think that the provisions that were included in the bipartisan USMCA digital chapter, and then building on that, U.S.-Japan, also looking to some of the innovations that have been made by our trade partners in the region, Australia, Singapore, and others, provide important new elements that can be included. At its core, and I think you've listed this in your resolution, we need to certainly address cross-border data flows. And I would point out that it is not the case that there is an absolute allowance of cross-border data flows in all circumstances. There is provision for deterrence from that where there are legitimate public policy objectives, and that is certainly something that we would want to see continued. Two, data localization is pernicious and increasing, and has wide implications, particularly in respect to challenges posed by China, and I think it also relates to the data issues that have been raised here today. And I also believe that the source code provisions, which again are not absolute, it's not an absolute prohibition on mandatory transfer of source code. There are exceptions to that for law enforcement, for not just judicial processes, but also regulators, inspections, and other circumstances. So just want to correct the record that that source code provision is not absolute. Also want to emphasize the importance of a permanent moratorium on e-commerce. And also new provisions that we've suggested, including things like AI best practices principles, which we think can address some of the issues that have been raised, particularly in Mr. Woodall's testimony with regard to concerns about potential abuses of AI in the workplace. We also think it's very important there be a commitment to worker upskilling in the digital area. We also think that inclusion of tools for small business is incredibly important, and certainly greater inclusivity is very important. And I also should mention addressing the pernicious problem of censorship. I think it's another area that should be addressed.
Good. Thank you for that comprehensive response. My time has expired, and we'll come back later in the hearing, and I'll have an opportunity to invite our other three witnesses to respond to the same question. And that having been said, my list, staff's given me a list that says the next person to recognize for questioning is Senator Grassley, and then Senator Cortez Masto. So, Senator Grassley, you're up, followed by Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. Fife. We're all concerned about national security and the data flow and We're concerned about consumers making sure that their technology is protected. And obviously, we think mostly about the Chinese Communist Party and China generally in this regard. So my first question is, you stated the need to ban TikTok and digital platforms that are similar. Could you explain why this is necessary?
Thank you, Senator. The threats posed by TikTok and, as your question suggests, by other platforms, and there are many that are subject to the same Chinese Communist Party influence and control and subversion, involves both data that would flow out of the United States to China and the data, in a sense, that that flows from Beijing and its political edicts into our digital economy. In that first category, you have the sort of relatively more commonly recognized data privacy concerns, which is that TikTok is on the phone of 100 million or more Americans. TikTok, in public statements and in congressional testimony, has given a whole range of often contradictory and questionable answers about how they can possibly keep that data that is on American phones and in the TikTok app from the Chinese Communist Party, given the nature of Chinese law. It would appear completely impossible because the laws dating, including the National Intelligence Law of China, the cybersecurity laws of China, more recently, the Data Security Law of China, and others make absolute demands on Chinese Communist Party unchecked access to data that touches Chinese platforms like TikTok. And so the risk of the harvesting of the data from all the American users is enormous. There is also, though, the somewhat less widely recognized set of risks involving the effect of the export of censorship from the Chinese Communist Party to the American public, when so much of the American public relies on this platform for news. News about the world, news about our elections, and possibly the news in future circumstances that might involve Taiwan, might involve different actions in which the U.S. and China are adverse. And the ability of TikTok to be a platform for the mass manipulation and even mobilization of American users, dictated and consistent with the hostile political aims of the Chinese Communist Party, to which TikTok has to answer by virtue of Chinese law, is a very grave threat.
What other countries that we have to worry about getting into our Americans' data? Are there other countries that are the same problem as China or near that?
There are certainly other countries that pose similar problems. There wouldn't appear to be any other country that poses the problems at the magnitude and severity of China. I would note, for example, that the Biden administration put out in June of 2021 an executive order on protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries. That foreign adversaries category, I believe, pursuant to some regs from the last administration, affects 6 countries: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and perhaps Venezuela. I'd want to check that, but I believe that's the set of foreign adversary countries. Several of the questions we've discussed have mentioned China and Russia together. Certainly those two would appear to stand out on the list of 6, but even still, there are not Russian platforms with a presence in the United States anything like the Chinese platforms. And the Chinese platform concern and the Chinese digital economy, digital trade concern is hardly limited to TikTok. TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, has a new virtual reality company subsidiary called Pico, which has ambitions for the U.S. metaverse market to compete here domestically against Facebook and Apple and all the others. There are a wide range of social media and payment and other platforms that come from China. They are widely used because they're good apps, but they also pose these enormous challenges that are often difficult for consumers to keep track of. They're often really only a threat in the aggregate when you talk about the aggregate of all of this data and what a foreign adversary government can do with it. But that's why it seems to pose these national security concerns that warrant attention here.
My time's out. I'm going to submit to Mr. Bliss a question for answer in writing.
All right, thanks, Senator Cortez. Thank you. All right, Senator Cortez Masto, you're up. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for this great subcommittee hearing, and I appreciate everybody that's participating today. Let me, it's Faith?
Fife.
Mr. Fife, let me start with you, because you talked about data harvesting. How long would you say data harvesting has been going on? How many years?
Roughly as long as we've had data.
And so do you think it is too late to start putting in regulatory regimes to protect, let's just say, an individual's PII?
No. Some harm is irreversible, but a lot of harm is still ahead of us.
And so, and when you're talking about harm, what do you identify that harm? What does it look like?
I think we can talk about it in various ways. There's the exposure of private information that is of potential intelligence value.
So national security, that's something we would always want to address.
Sure.
But let's talk about individuals, because one of the things you talked about, which I am very concerned about, but I'm also concerned that it might be too late, is protections for biodata. And we definitely need to do something, as you have said, but is it too late? I mean, that information is already out there for many, and you can't pull it back. How would we address that?
I think the observation that there have been transfers here that are harmful and that harm can't be remedied, I would agree with completely for things, transfers that have already happened. And yet, I would also be inclined to say that, there are uses of biodata that are currently devised, but are imperfect and will still need to be fed by enormous amounts of data that companies and governments, will seek to ingest over time. But some will seek to do so in ways that are generally consistent with democratic values and the rule of law, and some will do so in the way that the Chinese Communist Party functions. Preventing the further ingestion of that sort of data over time for these uses of biodata already devised would seem to be a major interest of ours. There's also, one would think, infinite uses of biodata not yet devised that will come about in the future, as with
Which
any...
we don't even contemplate right now, but
even
it's going to, with new technology and everything that's out there, it'll be there. I agree with you. I agree with you. And I think this is part of our challenge, is trying to figure out what this regulatory regime looks like and what data and what we are trying to protect.
And if I could just note, in addition to the ICTS process, which is an administrative instrument that is out there and that has an important mandate to go implement, I would note, Senator Wyden was here and has left, I see, but he introduced a bill that has several Republican co-sponsors, and I think also Senator Whitehouse might be on the bill as well, back in June to create a new export control category for bulk American data. Mm-hmm. And so this would essentially take the export control system that we have long had, at the Commerce Department, led by its Bureau of Industry and Security, and create a new element of it to focus on the bulk transfer of American personal data, in principle, to try to combat all of these sorts of risks. There are, enormous complications with how exactly this would be done. I would just observe that it is notable and I think unfortunate that, that bill pointing at a really important national security, China-related concern that we have is not the subject of more debate and consideration, including, for example, in the major legislative process that you all completed this summer with the CHIPS Act. And so it would seem another opportunity in the new Congress, presumably, to look at that effort and other ways at getting at that same very important problem.
I agree. Thank you. And so what I'm hearing from you today is the ICTS committee concept that's on white paper is a good start, is where we should be starting here.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there any state, I'm curious, is there any state that you guys are aware of that has put in protections that we should be looking at? That's a good model.
I'll happily defer to colleagues as well. I would just note that the short answer would appear to be no. The Europeans, through their GDPR, mm-hmm. have a much more aggressive and mature and advanced data privacy framework. But they've been mostly directing it against the United States and our big tech players and questions about the privacy shield and what the U.S. government might do with European personal data that gets sent across the Atlantic. The European approach to data, for all of its vigor, has been rather uninterested in the fact that the data protections for Europeans in China are nil. And these Chinese platforms, of course, operate in Europe as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Cortez-Masto, thank you. Senator Casey was here. He had to leave. He may be back. And when he comes back, I'll recognize him. Senator Wyden was here. He had to leave for a while. I think he'll be back, and we'll recognize him. But meanwhile, live and in person, Senator Young, to welcome. Somebody who shares my passion for these issues, and we appreciate very much his leadership in allowing me to be his wingman on some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for speaking to this important issue, digital trade. I see incredible opportunities and some risk as we try and plot our way forward. The risk, I think, emerges because there's a sense of urgency, at least I feel it, for the United States to work with partners and allies to kind of further refine our rules in this area. And as it relates to this area, as with so many other international policies, we need to come up with rules that are somewhat flexible, that are consistent across international boundaries. So there are a lot of commonalities between the work that I think is going to be required here and what we do in other areas. We also need to make sure that we're effective. We got to make sure our digital trade rules can prevent the bad actors from purloining our data and preventing us from growing to the extent we otherwise would and landing market share, since the United States leads in so many of these areas, from digital platform to digital services and so forth. And I think we can do a real service to many of our allied countries across the Indo-Pacific in particular. I know there's been much conversation about that here today. The administration, I think appropriately, has recognized the importance of the Indo-Pacific, the digital trade pillar within the IPEF, by recognizing the importance of this issue. But I feel like a more targeted approach is necessary. And I know colleagues on both sides of the aisle agree with me with respect to that. The chairman and I have just introduced a resolution, in fact, indicating our belief in the importance of this area. And we hope that continues to gain more support. My first question would be of Ms. Bliss. We have some recent experience in this area of digital trade rulemaking, right, with USMCA. I'm just looking at a punch list of things that are included there. USMCA prohibits custom duties on digital products, a commitment to non-discrimination, localization requirements, no forced disclosure of source codes and algorithms, requires parties to establish civil and criminal procedures and penalties for trade secret theft, and recognizes risk-based approaches and the need for strengthened cooperation between governments on cybersecurity. Those are among the things that are called for in USMCA. How is this different as we look at the Indo-Pacific context? What, just very briefly, what differences will be required to cater to the Indo-Pacific countries?
Well, first of all, I want to commend you, as I did Senator Carper, for your leadership introducing your resolution on digital trade and working with allies and listing barriers. I think it was very effective and important. But to your point, I think that because we're not looking at an FTA negotiation and we're looking at a different kind of initiative that doesn't directly offer market access, one of the challenges is going to be how we convince some of our countries that may not be like-minded, but that are participating in the trade pillar and the digital piece, to come on board and high-level standards. So one of the differences I would point to is I think it's going to be very important that we do build in incentives like capacity building, and hopefully encouraging them to create, countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, to create environments that will attract foreign investment, which we know they desperately want. The other thing I would point out is that I think another difference is that we think it's really important to include some new provisions that go beyond what was done in USMCA and US-Japan. And I've outlined that to the committee previously, but just for example, I think we absolutely need to include principles on AI. I think that's very important. I think we also need to include something on digital worker upskilling. I think that's important for U.S. workers as well as it is for IPEF countries. I think we need to include something on SME digital tools and something on greater inclusivity, just to name a few. And I also want to highlight for the discussion, particularly some of the remarks that Mr. Faith had made, that cybersecurity, I think, is a very important area that we need to build on as well.
Thank you for that. There's just so much here. It is a very broad topic, and good subcommittee hearings typically are based on broad topics. They give us an opportunity to move into a number of areas. So one of the areas that I know my constituents are interested in are the national security implications of digital trade and maybe not getting the rules right as we try and address certain challenges. So I'd like to ask Mr. Faith some questions in this area. Mr. Faith, specifically, I'm interested in the challenges some of my colleagues have brought up with China. China it's one of the most digitally restrictive economies in the world, but it's also one of the largest consumer markets in the world. And in your testimony, you covered many examples that show how the Chinese Communist Party is accumulating and exploiting data and pushing policies that allow them to selfishly advance their own authoritarian interests. So, Mr. Faith, I'll just ask you an open-ended question here. What's at stake if we sit back and we let China dictate standards in digital trade? What's at stake if the United States fails to boldly solidify some international standards, especially as we look at the Asia-Pacific area?
Well, thanks, Senator. As with many things, China, taking seriously the words of the Chinese Communist Party leadership and of Xi Jinping can be instructive on this issue. What he has said is at stake in the contest over data and over which countries and political systems are best able to recognize the significance of data and exploit data. He has said it's the matter of the upper hand in future world power. He has been saying this actually for quite a while. It was 10 years ago that he compared data in our century to oil in the last century as the most important component of economic and therefore national power.
And do you agree with his assessment?
Yes. Not because it's his, but because it's there's an insight there.
No, and in fact, I think each of us would be wise not to dismiss his assessment because it happens to come from a Chinese communist leader, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Faith. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
You bet. There's a great song I heard the other day, You Gotta Have Faith. There's no song that's ever said you gotta have faith. And has anybody ever mispronounced your name, Mr. Fife?
It's been done.
Even today? Yeah. I like to say
That's
Fife.
an excellent mnemonic device.
Fife as in wife. There you go. All right, we're rejoined by our committee chairman, Senator Biden. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Senator Carper. The election is supposed to be over, but things are just as hectic as before. And I'm going to ask you a question, if I might, Mr. Meltzer. Obviously, businesses and workers and consumers understand that in our country, the internet is free and open. And having come to the United States Senate when virtually nobody knew how to use a computer, that was something that I've been dedicated to, that proposition, ever since I had the honor of coming here. So our internet is free and open. The communist China builds its great firewall higher and higher year after year, shutting out our businesses and crushing dissent. We're obviously watching on our TV screens today the way the regime censors protests, pushes back against a draconian COVID lockdown, and brutally cracks down on dissent. My view is that we are watching every night unfold a human rights disaster, and it is spreading like wildfire with our trading partners in India, Vietnam, and Indonesia. All across the world, for example, surveillance is becoming the new normal, and technologies used to monitor worker communication, stamp out dissent, and organizing. So I thought, because of your expertise, Mr. Meltzer, it would be helpful to have you briefly outline several of the smartest reforms that could be made to our trade policy to put the United States in a position to push back as effectively as possible against these human rights crackdowns?
Thank you, Senator, for the question, and I certainly agree with your observation in terms of what's unfolding at the moment. It's a dynamic space, and there's clearly an important role, I think, for US leadership on digital trade policy issues as a key component of building an ecosystem, I think, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, which reaffirms the norm of an open and free internet. In many respects, this is sort of the centre of where this broader strategic conflict, I think, between the US and I should say the West really and China is going to play out on the ground. And we see this happening in versions of trade policy which China is advocating compared to what would be a preferred, I think, US approach. And one need only look at, for instance, at the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which on one level is not a bad agreement, but includes a lot of loopholes and exceptions for China's sort of approach to the internet and restrictions on data flows and so forth. And we have a lot of important countries in the region that are now party to that agreement, and which has become a baseline for them. And it refers specifically to the ASEAN countries, which are obviously part of the RCEP agreement. They're negotiating a digital economy framework agreement probably starting next year, and that will be their starting point and moving them towards a more a view of digital trade which is more consistent with the view that the United States has of what would be an appropriate way forward in terms of data regulation and free flow of data, I think, is an important objective here. And part of achieving that is going to be US re-engagement, I think, on digital trade policy in the region.
So my time is going to run out shortly. You're a member of this committee in a hypothetical question. What kinds of changes to our trade policy would you advocate, to our digital trade policies, in order to allow our country to push back as effectively as possible on these human rights violations?
Well, I think that it would require starting with what we've got and then using the full weight of the US access to the US market to incentivize the region to adopt an approach to data flows and data regulation that is.
And what would be an example of such an incentive?
Well, I honestly think, Senator, that the US, I think that IPEF may get us part of the way there, but I think a comprehensive sort of trade agreement that built in a set of digital trade rules that it built on USMCA, I think we need a lot more. We've heard a lot more on this panel about what that might comprise, so I won't repeat that. But I think that the rules which are combined with enforcement plus the incentive of access to the US market as kind of the key piece that kind of incentivizes compliance with the rules would be part of the kind of comprehensive.
We are very much interested in incentives here in the Senate Finance Committee. The reason we got a breakthrough with respect to clean energy, policy is we wrote a piece of legislation that said the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. So you got us at hello on the proposition that incentives are a good thing. So we'll hold the record open with Chair Carper's permission, and I'd be very interested in a couple of examples of your ways to tie these incentives. And open markets are certainly, one possibility. But if we're going to actually put them down into policy, we're going to need to be able to lay this out in a straightforward way. That's what we did with respect to clean energy. After 20 years of gridlock, we said, hey, we're going to make this pretty simple. It's going to be technology neutral. It's going to be market oriented. Everybody is going to have a chance to be part of a new system. But the incentive is you get the tax savings if you do what the public needs so desperately, which is to reduce carbon emissions. So if you can give us something that resembles that as it relates to digital trade markets, we will give you a parade and a hot fudge sundae, okay?
Well, that's a great incentive for me, Senator. And I will add on the incentive front that there is an infrastructure component here, which is really a development issue in a lot of the world still. When we talk about digital trade issues for a lot of the world, getting access to the internet, sufficient broadband is very crucial. And I think there's a role here for the US to play a more significant place in supporting the infrastructure build and the investment that's needed in the digital space as well, which would then support the apps and the content and the services after that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for coming back, not being here just once but twice. We very much appreciate that. The help of your staff in putting this hearing together. We've been joined by Senator Warren. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
Please proceed. You're recognized for 2 hours.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. So giant corporations use bad trade deals to pad their profits and to chip away at protection for workers and for consumers. And now that the U.S. and other governments are trying to rein in big tech, their lobbyists and lawyers are trying to rig digital trade rules to undermine those new regulatory laws. They wrote some of the digital rules in the new NAFTA agreement, and now they're trying to rig the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations as well. So take artificial intelligence, or AI. Companies increasingly rely on AI, even though AI, for example, can discriminate systematically, rejecting a job or loan for an applicant for having a black-sounding name, or penalizing a worker for a disability, or misidentifying women of color in police footage. This raises big concerns, and Congress and regulators are now taking a very close look at what's going on. But big tech wants to keep its code in a black box where nobody gets to look at it. Mr. Woodall, you're the policy director at the AFL-CIO Technology Institute. You are an expert on digital trade. Under the source code secrecy rules that big tech is now pushing as part of its digital trade agenda, could Congress pass pending legislation requiring that companies submit their AI code to the government or to third parties, say, to assess it for potential bias?
Senator, obviously Congress could pass those laws to address the discriminatory impacts of AI in the workplace, but they could run afoul of the digital trade rules and be vulnerable to a challenge or a trade dispute. Obviously, the reliance on this necessary and legitimate clause or justification would be, I think, a little thin reed to hide behind. The question is, legitimate to whom, necessary to whom, and recognizing that in the digital and technology world, our sort of regulatory landscape is very, very thin. Most of the other trade areas have been built where really the WTO went into effect decades after we had environmental protections and workplace safety rules. So this is a very different sort of environment where the digital trade has a different impact on the ability to address the known downsides of technology on workers and people.
Okay, so that is a really powerful point. Now, you know, tech lobbyists like to say that source code secrecy is about protecting trade secrets from China, but they have written the trade rules to apply to everyone, including U.S. regulators. Now, the tech lobbyists will say the language includes exceptions that ensure that regulators can still get access. So what I want to do is just take another closer look at the fine print on this. Regulators can look at source code or algorithms for, quote, a specific investigation, inspection, examination, enforcement action, or judicial proceeding. Mr. Woodall, could regulators really use this exception? Is this going to solve the problem?
I think it's a real concern, Senator. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons. One is that this sort of flags the VW problem, right? Where EPA got a whistleblower sent the source code to EPA that flagged that there was a problem with VW spoofing emissions tests. Now, the question is whether there would be an ability to know to pursue these kinds of investigations. It's really a chicken and egg problem, right? You have to know enough to be able to pursue the investigation. And so this specificity language could make it hard to really know whether to launch an investigation without being able to see under the hood. And then the second sort of problem with the specificity language is it pretty much precludes sector-wide or practice-wide investigations that regulators frequently pursue to see how consumers are protected or what's going on in the workplace. So I think that the recognition that there's a legitimate role for government is good, but the narrowing it to a very specific case really is a concern for us.
Okay, so I get your point. So big tech wants to protect whatever is in the black box from AI, and they not only want to protect it from China, they want to protect it from U.S. regulators. But of course, big tech companies only care about secrecy when it's their secrets that they want to protect. Meanwhile, they're fighting to protect their ability to collect, to store, and to sell your data anywhere else that they want in the world. And that's why the tech lobbyists behind the trade rules prohibit any limits on the international transfer of data. So what if we wanted, here in the United States, to put limits on the transfer of sensitive data, say period tracking data or location data for people who visited abortion clinics? Especially, we want to put limits to countries with poor data protections. Mr. Woodall, big tech says we shouldn't worry because countries can still pass laws to protect data so long as they fit under standard trade agreement language called the legitimate public policy exception. But how often have countries actually succeeded in using this language to defend their laws protecting consumers or workers or the environment?
It's quite infrequent. Less than 5% of the cases where at the WTO where regulations were challenged as illegal trade barriers were upheld under these necessary and legitimacy type tests. So it's very difficult to survive under these particular policy caveats. But as I said, I think it's going to be harder with digital because we have so little regulatory infrastructure and foundation upon which to defend the legitimacy and the necessity of the regulation. So as we're sort of, look, this is a world where we're just beginning to confront the concerns of this. And there are a bunch of laws being considered in Congress that would affect things like digital privacy and monopolistic platform practices that could run afoul of these digital trade rules. I would add on the privacy issues, the language in the USMCA specifically says it must be necessary and proportionate to the risk, which is sort of an even higher threshold to defend future privacy rules. So all of this, look, there's a good reason to consider protecting privacy and protecting the data that is behind privacy for things, as have been said on this panel already, on things like biometrics, on health data, on financial data. There are good reasons to exclude those kinds of personal data from the digital, from the free flow of data and data localization. And there are good reasons to exclude things like critical infrastructure has also been said today. So I think thinking about exceptions to these data provisions is essential going forwards.
Okay, so thank you. It's a very, very powerful point you make. We're barely at 5% success rate on trying to enforce the exceptions, and you're saying it would be even worse under the conditions if we go forward in the digital area here. You know, it is not a surprise that big tech is trying to weaponize digital trade rules. They know that the U.S. Congress is now considering bipartisan legislation to try to rein in big tech. So this is a move to fight back. And let's be blunt, big tech has a lot of friends. I've raised concerns about the revolving door between big tech and the agencies like the Commerce Department that are leading our digital trade negotiations. We can't let big tech hijack current trade negotiations like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Voters want Congress to strengthen their digital rights, and our trade agenda must reflect that approach. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your indulgence for the long questions and answers.
No, we're happy to welcome you and indulge you as much as you needed. That was great. Thanks for that exchange. Thank you for the enthusiasm you bring to these subjects too. The Small Business Administration does a lot to promote the establishment of small businesses to grow them, and they push something. Well, I think it's rolls around every Saturday, maybe right after Thanksgiving, and they call it Small Business Saturday. And the idea is to try to encourage people across the country to patronize our small businesses. I think it's a good thing, and I enjoy doing that. And we try to help nurture those small businesses. A lot of times they grow up to be really big businesses, and I have a question that relates to small businesses. And some small businesses understand every word you're saying, others don't. And so just keep that in mind as you respond to this question. But a question, I think I'm going to ask you, and if you'll do it, Dr. Meltzer, to join us as well. But same question, and I'd like maybe Ms. Bliss, you can go first. But question is, digital connectivity has the power to unlock really tremendous opportunities, not just for big businesses or middle-sized businesses, but for small businesses too, by connecting them with consumers across the globe. Some of the small businesses I visited with my staff just in the last couple of weeks, we've actually saw that with our own eyes and heard it with our own ears. However, small businesses often need additional support in order to access foreign markets and to reap the benefits of our digital economy. Question. What resources can help small businesses participate in the digital economy? And how can digital trade rules facilitate new export opportunities for small and middle-sized entrepreneurs? Ms. Bliss, would you go first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'll forgive me, but I think
I forgive you.
but I just want
You don't even have to ask me to forgive you.
to divert for one moment, and then I will
Sure.
answer your question. And that is that I think it is unfortunate that there is an enduring perception among some that that the digital agenda is about big tech and driven by big tech. And I think my organization is an example of that. Yes, we do have several large tech companies, but they're only about 10% of my membership. And we have large and small businesses represented in manufacturers. And as I said in my testimony, I think you certainly understand, and others do as well, that this and building strong digital rules is really across the board, not just about big tech. It's across sectors, across industries. And so that's what I was going to ask your forgiveness for, if I could divert for that for a moment. But back to small business. I think that it's very clear that I know that the Commerce Department does a good job of doing and providing information to small business to help them export. I think there needs to be a lot more of that. I think small business needs to be provided with digital tools. I know certainly among my members, there's a lot of that going on where they have facilitator labs for startups and small businesses where they give them digital tools, whether it's AI, use of platforms, other digital technologies, cloud technologies. But I think there needs to be more of that from the government as well as the private sector, maybe in public-private partnerships. To answer your question about what specifically should be included in IPEF, for example, we think that it's very important that there be a provision about where countries commit to the importance of providing those digital tools to small business and capacity building in particular. Certainly in the United States, it's very important, but also in IPEF countries. And so, you know, I think that alone would be maybe the most helpful thing that could be done for small business in terms of specific provision that could be added in IPEF, and also just general capacity building that I know CSI member companies are also already doing in the U.S., but also in IPEF countries.
All right, thank you. Same question for Dr. Meltzer. What resources can help small businesses participate in the digital, better help small businesses to participate in the digital economy? And how can digital trade rules facilitate new export opportunities for both small and medium-sized enterprises?
Senator, thank you for the question. Let me just go directly to the question of the digital trade rules. I think it's really worth noting that in many respects, these rules are perhaps most important for small businesses because the reality is, at the end of the day, a lot of large businesses can manage the frictions and the costs, and they can locate facilities in countries where they may need to, but it is just not an option for small businesses. And so a lot of the way that the digital trade rules minimise transaction costs and make e-commerce particularly seamless is really the key benefit for them. I'd think about this in three buckets. I mean, there's what I would think about as those that facilitate e-commerce, and there's some that have been around for a while but are really quite essential, like recognising e-signatures. You can't do a contract if that's not recognised in both countries. Issues around digital authentication and digital ID are new developments that also allow one to basically have more seamless kind of person-to-person interaction online. The de minimis duty outcomes in USMCA, which raised that in Canada and Mexico, have facilitated e-commerce exports to these countries. There was a whole range of de minimis levels globally that we could look at trying to kind of find some agreement on. And just nuts and bolts of the way customs procedures work and so forth, which is sort of the old work of trade policy, which is actually still relevant for e-commerce because we're doing a lot of digital services online, but we're also doing a lot of goods purchase online that still have to go through the typical trade channels, but making sure they're fit for these kind of small business transactions is important. Another one I would mention is around interoperability. The US-EU Privacy Shield 2.0 is one that's got a lot of attention because of its impacts on Facebook, but it would have had enormous impacts on a whole range of small businesses if small businesses that were selling into Europe were able to collect personal data once they made that transaction. So ensuring that despite differences in regulations, data can flow freely, personal data can flow freely but remain protected, I think is a key thing that digital trade rules can continue to address, and that will have a big impact on small businesses. And finally, we've all talked about, but I mentioned in my written testimony and my oral testimony the importance of sort of platforms solving for a lot of the barriers that allow small businesses to become exporters. The data flow piece is absolutely key there as well.
Okay, good. Thanks for that response. Ms. Bliss, at one point in time when he was responding, I was watching you, and you were vigorously nodding your head. And I think maybe I should call on her again. So you want to jump in and add something?
I totally agree with what Dr. Meltzer described, and I'm so glad that he mentioned trade facilitation because that's another really important piece. But I also want to mention that I think a permanent moratorium on e-commerce duties is also critical, especially to small business, because that is something that can definitely hurt, particularly if there was retaliation, if it were to lapse and not exist, with respect to small business, both exporting and importing. So I just wanted to add that one as well.
Good, I'm glad you did. Mr. Fife, do you want to opine on this one? No?
Thanks, sir.
All right. Maybe I'll give you another shot at a different question, okay? This one deals with bolstering our cybersecurity and our digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure, including things like broadband, like data centers, like physical input, like semiconductors, are critical or have become critical to global trade and have been for some time. What vulnerabilities currently exist related to our digital infrastructure? Could you talk about some of those, and how can we safeguard these resources, maybe better safeguard these resources in order to protect the cybersecurity of American workers and our businesses?
Well, thanks, Senator. It's a huge subject, and I'll try to give you a limited answer. I think that we've seen a lot of really important action on recognizing the China-related threat in cyberspace generally around things like the theft of intellectual property, say over the last decade, the threat that relates to telecommunications infrastructure in the U.S. and around the world, especially over the last 5 years or so, understanding of what Huawei and ZTE and others mean. We've seen steady action from parts of our government that are responsible for those areas. We still need more of it, but we've seen out of places like the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission over the years, including just last week, a lot of effort to sort of gradually and increasingly restrict the ability of Chinese companies subject to Chinese Communist Party influence and control to be present in the hardware and software of the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure. One thing that I would note, though, that is really interesting and kind of emergent about what this means in our consumer economy, but also in our national critical infrastructure, are things like drones and surveillance systems and cameras. Some of these areas are, in a sense, uncovered by our traditional regulatory approaches. And so on drones, you've had this interesting and rather frustrating scene over the last several years where various parts of the U.S. government, DHS, the Pentagon, and others, have put out statements that relate to the fact that that these Chinese drones are pose these major data integrity concerns because of the complete ability of the data to be subverted by Beijing and used for hostile purposes. But the statements from DHS, for example, are just advisory, useful and educational, but not really restrictive when it comes to what, say, state governments or local law enforcement or power grid operators do when it comes to procuring drones. Some of those DHS advisories succeeded in getting operators of power grid infrastructure, for example, to get rid of their Chinese procured drones. But others didn't get the message, and the message was just advisory. It was not mandatory. That sort of thing is present, broadly throughout, and there are parts of the picture, such as the autonomous transport piece and the digital mapping piece, that appear to have gone basically entirely unremarked on, even by in advisory statements from the U.S. government, because we're still catching up with this issue. So we have an issue where the leading autonomous transport companies in the country doing really advanced things in California and Arizona and elsewhere are in many cases deeply tied to financing and engineering, other connections to China, to the Chinese state, to the Chinese military, and yet they operate freely. They operate without restriction when it comes to the transport, the sharing of U.S. road and port and other critical infrastructure digital mapping data internationally back to engineering fleets in China. And all of that would seem to pose really very significant risks in the sort of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure areas that you've asked about.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think maybe one last question. My last question, I'll just telegraph this pitch. I'm going to ask you a number of things. A number of times I'll ask witnesses, what should we do on this issue or that issue? What should we do? What would be your advice? I'm going to ask you to give us one example of something we should not do as we go forward. Something we should not, don't do that. Okay, so just be thinking about that. Okay, my question my next question is Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, where are you coming to us from today? Where are you?
In Washington.
Oh, good, good. You seem close. I could feel that. But anyway, whether you're in Washington, D.C. or Washington State, we're delighted to have you join us. How long have you been involved with the AFL-CIO Technology Institute?
For about a year.
Okay. Do you start right out of school?
Yes, but not here. I've been working on global trade policy for decades.
Really? Okay, well, good. My question, serious question, is: as the use of digital technology grows and as it evolves, It's critical that American workers feel the benefits of these innovations in a couple of ways. One would be through better jobs, and the other would be better wages and higher wages. My question would be, how can digital trade cooperation investments in our workforce help ensure that American workers develop the kinds of skills that are needed for success in the digital economy? I visit businesses, large and small, a lot. When we're on recess for several weeks earlier this month. And almost every day I visited businesses, large and small. And I would ask them, how are we doing in Congress and the state of Delaware, and what can we do to help? Actually, what I heard more than anything else, believe it or not, was we just need people to come to work. People are trainable, who have skills, requisite skills, are trainable to have additional skills, add additional skills. That's what that's what they said that they were looking for and needed. So I'm focusing right now on that a whole lot. But that relates to my question: how can digital trade cooperation investments in our workforce help ensure that American workers develop the skills needed for success in the digital economy?
I think obviously investment in workforce is critical for the next generation of technologies. This sort of discussion is going on around the Chips and Science Act and in other parts of the administration's agenda. We've been very involved to make sure that the jobs that are create good union jobs with good pay and provide opportunities for advancement. So we're very supportive of that. I think what we're concerned about in the digital trade arena is the extent to which some of these technologies are really corrosive on workplace conditions and workplace fairness and erode workers' income. And so we've seen this with a lot of the algorithmic management issues, and we're very concerned that it'll be difficult to address things like workplace surveillance, the unfairness behind algorithmic management that workers face every day in the workplace. And frankly, much of this surveillance is off the job as well. So it needs to be a situation where there's enough domestic governance space to protect workers from the downsides of the digitization, as well as provide opportunities for workers going forward with real workforce development that centers workers in that process.
All right, thanks. Any of our other witnesses want to comment on that? Ms. Bliss?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add that I think that one of the things that we've certainly endorsed and think is important is that there be a provision included in the new digital piece of IPEF and in other U.S. initiatives that addresses AI principles, including respect for human-centered values, which is certainly one of the OECD AI principles that we think is very important and could be helpful, and addressing concerns about things like abuse of AI.
Okay, good, thanks. Mr. Feith, anything else you'd like to add on that front?
No, sir.
No. Dr. Meltzer?
Just building on Christine Bliss's point, the White House has released a blueprint for AI, human rights in AI, and I think this would be an excellent starting point to think about including in a digital trade agreement, because it would certainly reflect US values, and I think we'll get a lot of the concerns that have been expressed today about to ensure that AI is used in a way which is consistent with human rights as well as labour standards.
Yeah. Mr. Feith, do you agree with that?
Sounds right.
Yeah. How about Ms. Bliss? Do you agree with that? Good. All righty. I told you I was going to ask you if you had any advice for us what not to do on this front. We'd welcome that. And Mr. Woodall, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to respond to that question first. No, I'm not asking you to advise us in Congress what we ought to do, but what ought we not to do? Be careful and avoid. Please, Mr. Woodall.
Certainly, I think there are a lot of things to be careful and avoid that I've talked about some, and I think one area to consider avoiding is avoid sort of blanket exclusions, and I would recommend something that would exclude personal vulnerable data and critical infrastructure from the data flow and data localization commitments that we've seen in other digital areas. I think these are areas where there's broad consensus that there needs to be more protection, and so we should sort of not include that.
Good. Dr. Meltzer, what should we avoid doing?
I'll wait. One comment about maybe the politics, which is not for me to manage, but avoid this becoming a partisan issue. I think it's a huge economic value across the US, and we should be able to get behind this. But I think specifically we should avoid walking away from anything that would dilute the commitment to data flows. I think the focus on the exceptions is really crucial here. It's really where the battle's being, I think, waged between maximising the economic opportunities and providing the regulatory space for governments to keep doing what they need to be doing. And I think that's really important that we might get that bit right.
Good. So, Senator Cornyn, who's the ranking member on this committee, I get to be on the subcommittee. I get to serve for a while as the chairman, but we like to work across the aisle, and we don't see these as partisan issues. And Todd Young, who was here, Senator Young, very much the same way, and that's the way I like to operate. Well, I get to chair Committee on Environment and Public Works. We a lot of big pieces of the bipartisan infrastructure bill came through our committee and were adopted unanimously in our committee and later by overwhelming margins in the Senate. We've reported out big pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act, big pieces including methane reduction programs unanimously, and later reported out unanimously Water Resource Development Act. It's before the Senate probably later next month. And so folks, a lot of folks across the country think, well, can't they work together on anything? But I'm just here to tell you that a lot of times we do. We don't get on television much by working together, but it's the glue that holds our country together, I think. Okay, here, my last question. Is there a question that you maybe thought you would be asked or wish had been asked that was not asked? Dr. Meltzer, is there a question maybe you hoped would be asked, thought would be asked, that was not asked?
I think part of the piece here is the way the rest of the world is looking at what the US is going to do in this space and the perspective that the rest of the world has on the decisions that the US makes. It's understandably a very domestically focused set of considerations at the moment, but the desire for, I think, US re-engagement on the digital trade piece in a lot of the Asia-Pacific couldn't be overstated. They are dealing with the challenges from China in a geographically proximate way on digital regulation broadly, including across a whole set of issues. And I think this is one piece of what's really being asked for in terms of US leadership that would be absolutely well received and welcomed in that part of the world.
Good, thank you. Same question, Mr. Fife.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll go back to your previous question about what not to do.
Yeah.
And I would offer a suggestion not to let these China data problems get so big they seem unfixable. TikTok was a lot smaller in its share of US social media and its cultural presence 2 years ago when the last administration attempted a ban. These things have grown bigger and more problematic more quickly. We had an interesting discussion about the biodata question and whether too much has been transferred already and whether it's too late. It would seem that it isn't too late, but it can become over time the more that these sorts of problematic data relationships with China give Beijing leverage over us and box us in, limit our decision-making, and ultimately, limit our kind of sovereign ability to protect ourselves in these ways.
Good, thanks for responding to that question as well. Ms. Bliss, and then Mr. Woodall, same questions. Question thought you might be asked, one that would like to have been asked, but were not asked. Go ahead.
Well, I think it was asked in some respects, but I think more about the importance of, and it's a corollary to what Dr. Meltzer raised, and the importance of U.S. leadership, but at the same time, what are the challenges that we face, particularly in IPEF, in getting not only our like-minded countries, but other countries that are now agreeing to participate in the trade bucket to get on board with a high set of digital principles. And I I do think we face some real challenges there, particularly from countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. So that would be one question. And the second thing, I will answer your previous question about what not to do. I think it's absolutely critical that in IPEF or any of our other initiatives with respect to digital, that we not go backwards. And that we build on what we've done. It can be improved, it should be added to, but we not go backwards.
All right, that's good advice. Okay, y'all, anybody have a last thought? Mr. Woodall, anything else you want to add or take away?
No, I mean, I expected to sort of be asked about the ephemera of digital affecting real workers' lives, and I think there's a recognition that there are real challenges workers face because of the digitization, and we need to deal with that in a more worker-centered digital trade provisions going forward.
Good. It's not everybody who answers a question in my committees with the word ephemeral, so thank you for that addition. I think that's pretty much it. I just want to close with some thank yous first. I want to thank each of you for taking time to join us in person or virtually from not too far away here in Washington. Thank you for what you do with your lives and for what you do for our country, directly or indirectly. I want to thank Senator Cornyn, with whom I'm privileged to lead this subcommittee, and frankly to work on a lot of issues, including some of the issues when the gun safety legislation was adopted several months ago. But we look for opportunities to work together. Have great respect for him and his staff, and also appreciate very much the efforts of Senator Todd Young and the opportunity to partner with him. And I would say to my own staff and other members of staff, including the majority and minority staff of the full committee, how much we appreciate their working with us as we put together this hearing. I have like a script here that tells me, it gives me how many days my colleagues have to submit their questions for the record, and they don't have much time. Senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 7 days from today. It's a pretty quick turnaround. Our witness, however, will have 45 days to respond to any questions for the record. So that should get us through, I think, through December, through the holidays, and maybe into the beginning of the new year. But if you get those questions, you receive those questions, just try to get them back to us before too long. And with that, I think it's a wrap. Thank you all. We're dismissed. Thanks so much.